Hey gang, welcome to the video for Workshop 4. We're looking at chapters 19 and 20. The first one is absorption costing versus variable costing, and the second one is budgets. This should be relatively straightforward and a little bit easier of a week, I think, compared to the previous weeks. So hopefully, as we're experiencing the midway point through the semester, you have a relatively easier workshop this week and a couple different concepts that we'll cover here in a short video. The first thing we want to look at is the difference between absorption costing and variable costing. Now, the easiest way to think about this is absorption costing is what we've previously done in the course, where three different things go into product cost. You have your raw materials, your direct labor, and our overhead. And under absorption costing, we're not differentiating between what's variable overhead and what is fixed overhead. So an example of a fixed overhead would be like a supervisor salary, where they're getting the same amount every period. A variable overhead might be utilities expense, where the more machine hours that we run through our plant, the more electricity is required, and so the more utilities are billed. So that would probably be a variable expense. Now, the difference between absorption costing and variable costing is what goes into our product cost. Remember, our product cost is what goes to inventory, shows up on the balance sheet, and then rolls through to cost of goods sold. A period cost avoids all of the inventory cost of goods sold and goes straight to expense. So let's look at a little diagram here: absorption costing versus variable costing. What goes into the actual product cost? Well, under absorption costing, we're absorbing all of these pieces. Okay, so we got the direct materials, direct labor, variable overhead, and fixed overhead. We're not differentiating between the two, both overheads to go into cost of goods sold. What about under variable costing? Well, we're only going to look at these direct costs, and then once we get to the overhead piece, variable, we're only looking at the variable piece. So that goes into inventory and then later cost of goods sold. What about fixed overhead cost? This is a period cost under variable costing. So this is not, all these check marks are product costs going to the balance sheet. Fixed overhead costs, like we talked about, our supervisor's salary. This is something that's going to go straight to the income statement under expenses. What's the importance of this when it comes to net income and our income statement? Well, it depends on whether or not we're using absorption costing or variable costing to determine what our gross margin is, as well as our net income. So which is going to have a higher net income in the first period? So we're starting with inventory of 0, and we're going to assume some product on the books at the end of the period. So in this case, the units produced are greater than the units sold. So we have a higher amount here under absorption costing than we do under variable costing, because part of our costs were variable, or I'm sorry, part of our costs were fixed under variable costing, and so this went straight to the income statement. Some of these costs right here, fixed overhead, were capitalized, taken to the balance sheet, and avoided expense for the first period until later when they're sold. So under absorption costing, if this is the first year, net income is going to be higher. Net income is going to be lower. Now, in the book, page 797 to 800, there's 3 different examples of what happens when the units produced are the same as the units sold, what happens when units produced are greater, which is this example here, and then what happens when the units sold are greater. If the units sold are greater, it's going to be flipped, okay, because we're going to catch up here, and more of our, what we initially capitalized in the previous period is going to roll through to cost of goods sold than what was put in variable costing for fixed overhead as a period cost. So that would flip-flop if the units sold were greater than what was produced. So make sure you understand what's going on. It's specifically this piece, fixed overhead, that is different between the two different areas. Now, if we were doing financial reporting that was in accordance with GAAP, this would be absorption costing that capitalizes the fixed overhead. That would be GAAP. But remember, managerial costing, we can pretty much do what we want, whatever provides more accurate information. So some companies do use variable costing there. So let's look at the difference now between variable costing income statement and what we've previously done in Accounting 201, and so far in this course looking at what an income statement typically looks like. So under a regular, we'll look at traditional over here. What does our income statement look like? Well, we have sales, minus cost of goods sold. This is where all our product costs go. Subtract that, what does that equal? Gross profit. Now what do we subtract here? We subtract our period costs, our expenses, and that equals net income. Okay? That's typically what we've seen before. That shouldn't be too difficult to follow here. We'll put a T here for traditional format. Okay, what about a variable costing income statement? Well, sales is still going to be the same. That's not changing. But what we're doing is we're shifting around what falls in the cost of goods sold bucket and what falls in the expense bucket. We're showing it in a different format here. So now we're going to show a variable cost up top. We'll do minus variable cost of goods sold minus variable SG&A. So here's our product cost, here's our period cost. Subtract those, and we have contribution margin. Remember, we talked about that in a previous workshop. Now, part of this, so we're taking the variable from cost of goods sold and the variable from our expenses, and we're moving that up to this line above contribution margin. Okay, what do we put below contribution margin? Well, now we put our fixed cost of goods sold, and we subtract our fixed SG&A. So rather than putting period cost, rather than putting product cost, period cost division here, we're dividing it by variable and fixed, and that'll get into our net income down there, income from operations. Okay. So what are we doing here? Now we got our fixed cost of goods sold. Oops, that line doesn't go there. Goes like that. Fixed SG&A going there. So we're moving our fixed cost below the line for contribution margin, our variable cost above the line for contribution margin. So make sure you understand from Chapter 19 the difference between absorption versus variable costing, and then what a variable income statement looks like, where we have our variable cost up top, our fixed cost down low. That's all we got for Chapter 19.